In the early months of 1941, the geopolitical balance in the Balkans was under acute strain. The Kingdom of Yugoslavia, formed in the aftermath of the First World War, had spent 2 decades attempting to integrate a diverse population of Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, Bosniaks, Macedonians, Montenegrins, and other groups under a central monarchy in Belgrade. The state's political cohesion was fragile, shaped by competing national ambitions and uneven economic development across its regions. Vardar Banovina, covering much of present-day Macedonia, was one of the less industrialized areas, heavily rural, with limited infrastructure, and historically contested by Bulgaria, Greece, and Serbia. Since the Balkan Wars and the Treaty of Bucharest in 1913, the region had been administered by Serbia and later incorporated into Yugoslavia, but it retained strong cultural and linguistic ties to neighboring Bulgaria. Internationally, the Axis powers' expansion across Europe placed Yugoslavia in a precarious position. To the northwest, Italy had annexed parts of Slovenia and Dalmatia after its 1940 entry into the war on Germany's side. To the east, Bulgaria, aligned with Berlin, sought to reverse the post-First World War territorial settlements that had stripped it of Macedonia. Germany's 1940 conquest of France and dominance in Central Europe left Yugoslavia surrounded by Axis-controlled or Axis-aligned states: Italy, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. In this environment, Belgrade's leadership, under Prince Regent Paul, faced mounting diplomatic pressure from Berlin to join the tripartite pact, a move that promised territorial adjustments at the expense of Greece but risked internal unrest. By early 1941, German strategic planning for the Balkans had 2 main drivers. First, the need to secure the southern flank before launching Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union. Second, to protect Italy's struggling campaign in Greece, where Italian forces had been repelled into Albania after their October 1940 invasion. The Wehrmacht required transit through Yugoslav and Bulgarian territory to execute its planned intervention against Greece. This made the alignment, or at least the acquiescence, of Yugoslavia essential. Militarily, Yugoslavia's armed forces were sizable on paper, with around 28 divisions, but they were poorly equipped compared to Axis standards, with much of their weaponry dating from the First World War. The Royal Yugoslav Army lacked modern tanks, had limited mechanization, and depended heavily on slow mobilization from a largely agrarian society. Air defense was weak, with fewer than 500 operational aircraft, many of them outdated models. Intelligence reports indicated low readiness and insufficient coordination among the various ethnic components of the armed forces. Public sentiment in Vardar Banovina was complex. Serbian administrators maintained firm control, but local resentment persisted over policies of centralization and cultural assimilation. Bulgarian nationalist organizations, suppressed since the interwar period, still maintained clandestine networks. Italian intelligence operating through agents in Albania also monitored the situation, seeing potential in exploiting local discontent should military intervention occur. In March 1941, Yugoslavia signed the Tripartite Pact, formally aligning itself with the Axis, but negotiating a special clause that exempted it from providing military assistance and allowed it to remain outside direct military operations. This move, intended to preserve peace and territorial integrity, triggered immediate opposition among segments of the Yugoslav officer corps and the general population. On 27 March 1941, a coup in Belgrade, led by officers opposed to the pact, overthrew the regency and brought the young King Peter II to the throne. The new government distanced itself from the Axis, signaling closer ties with Britain and the Soviet Union. From Berlin's perspective, the coup transformed Yugoslavia from a reluctant partner into a potential obstacle. Adolf Hitler, already committed to assisting Italian forces in Greece, now ordered the rapid destruction of Yugoslavia as a political entity. The invasion plan, Fall 25, was integrated into the wider April campaign against both Yugoslavia and Greece. Axis coordination brought together Germany, Italy, Hungary, and Bulgaria, For Bulgaria, the operation presented an opportunity to occupy Vardar Macedonia and annex it under the banner of national unification. Italy, operating from occupied Albania, aimed to extend influence into Western Macedonia and connect its holdings along the Adriatic with its forces in Greece. Germany's role would be decisive in military terms, but its interest in direct occupation of Macedonian territory was limited. Berlin preferred to delegate control to its allies while securing strategic routes for the southern campaign. By the final days of March 1941, Axis forces were assembling along the Yugoslav borders. German 12th Army units concentrated in Bulgaria, supported by armored and motorized formations, prepared to cross into Macedonia through the Strumica Valley. Italian forces in Albania prepared to push into the Debar and Struga areas, while Bulgarian troops stood ready to enter from the east once German advances had secured key junctions. Yugoslavia's southern defenses, stretched thin and reliant on mountainous terrain for natural protection, faced a coordinated, multi-front assault that would unfold within days. At dawn on the 6th of April 1941, the Axis offensive began with coordinated strikes across Yugoslavia's borders. The Luftwaffe initiated Operation Retribution, a series of aerial bombardments targeting Belgrade and other strategic points, aiming to cripple communication and command infrastructure before ground forces advanced. In the southern sector, the focus was on neutralizing Yugoslav positions in Vardar Banovina and opening routes for German and Bulgarian forces to link up with the drive into Greece. Airfields near Skopje and Bitola came under attack, reducing the already limited capacity of the Royal Yugoslav Air Force to contest Axis control of the skies. The German 12th Army, under Field Marshal Wilhelm List, advanced from Bulgaria with elements of the XL Panzer Corps, including the 9th Panzer Division and the 73rd Infantry Division. Their primary objectives in Macedonia were to capture Skopje and Veles, secure the Vardar Valley, and push toward the Greek border to cut off British and Greek forces engaged on the Albanian front. The terrain offered challenges, narrow passes, river crossings, and mountain ridges, but German motorized units, supported by close air cover, moved rapidly against Yugoslav positions that were underprepared for mechanized warfare. From the east, Bulgarian troops, initially not in open combat, followed closely behind the Germans. Officially, Bulgaria maintained that it was not at war with Yugoslavia, but in practice its army was integrated into Axis operational planning. Once German forces had broken through, Bulgarian units entered to establish administrative control, particularly in areas with a significant Bulgarian-speaking population. Their immediate goal was the restoration of civil authority under Sofia's direction, but this also involved disarming local Yugoslav garrisons and replacing Serbian officials. To the west, Italian forces from the 9th Army crossed from Albania into western Macedonia. Their operations were directed toward the towns of Debar, Struga, and Ohrid, with the intention of linking their advance to operations in Epirus and securing the Ohrid-Bitola corridor. Italian progress was slower, impeded by mountainous terrain and the need to divert troops to maintain pressure on Greek positions further south. However, their presence ensured that the Axis pincer in Macedonia extended from both east and west, preventing a Yugoslav retreat toward Greece without encountering hostile forces. Yugoslav resistance in the region was fragmented. The Third Army, responsible for defending the southern approaches, deployed the Vardar, Bregalnica, and Morava divisions, but these formations were understrength, dispersed, and hampered by disrupted communications following the initial air raids. Defensive lines around Skopje collapsed within 2 days under the combined pressure of German armored thrusts and Luftwaffe dominance. Attempts to mount counterattacks were localized and short-lived, often ending in withdrawal when flanking movements threatened encirclement. By the 8th of April, German spearheads had entered Skopje, seizing the city with minimal street fighting. Control of the city was a decisive strategic gain. It was the central hub for road and rail links in Macedonia, enabling rapid redeployment of forces toward both the Greek border and western Yugoslavia. Bulgarian administrators, accompanied by security units, began arriving almost immediately, signaling the shift from military conquest to occupation and governance. The speed of the advance left large parts of the Yugoslav military in Macedonia cut off from central command. Units in the south, near Gevgelija and Strumica, found themselves bypassed as German columns moved along the main valleys. Others retreated toward the Albanian border, hoping to regroup with Italian forces in an uncertain tactical environment. Civilians experienced the transition abruptly, one day under Yugoslav authority, the next under foreign control. Reports from the time indicate that reactions varied. Some communities greeted Bulgarian troops as liberators. Others viewed the arrival of Axis forces with apprehension or outright hostility. By the end of the first week of the campaign, the military balance in Macedonia was decisively in Axis hands. The rapid collapse of organized resistance created the conditions for the political division of the territory. Germany, having achieved its operational goals, was ready to transfer the majority of administrative responsibility to its allies, setting the stage for the formal partition between Bulgaria, Italy, and German-controlled zones. The formal Partition of Macedonia, following the April 1941 invasion, was the product of both prearranged political agreements and ad hoc decisions made in the aftermath of the rapid Yugoslav collapse. Germany, whose primary concern in the region was to secure lines of communication for its campaign in Greece and safeguard its southern flank for the upcoming offensive against the Soviet Union, had little interest in administering Macedonia directly. Instead, Berlin facilitated the expansion of its Balkan allies into territories they had long claimed, thereby reinforcing political loyalty and ensuring stability behind the front lines. Bulgaria was the principal beneficiary in the division. Sofia's government, led by Tsar Boris III, regarded the annexation of most of Vardar Macedonia as the realization of a national unification agenda that had been pursued since the Balkan Wars. German authorities formally authorized Bulgarian control over a broad swath of territory, extending from the Bulgarian border westward to the line roughly connecting the towns of Tetovo, Skopje, and Ohrid. This area included the economically and strategically important Vardar Valley, which provided a direct transport corridor from Central Europe to the Aegean Sea. Bulgarian administration replaced Serbian civil and military structures, introducing Bulgarian language education, legal systems, and currency. The Bulgarian Orthodox Church extended its jurisdiction into the occupied parishes, reinforcing the integration of the region into the Bulgarian national framework. Italian claims were based primarily on their occupation of Albania and their interest in creating a continuous sphere of influence stretching from the Adriatic to the Aegean. Under the agreement with Germany, Italy received control over a smaller portion of western Macedonia adjacent to Albania. This included the districts of Debar, Struga, and the Ohrid area, as well as parts of Gostivar and Kičevo. These territories were integrated into the Italian-governed Albanian kingdom, administered from Tirana, which functioned as a protectorate under Rome's authority. Italian policy emphasized infrastructural links between these districts and Albania, aiming to facilitate troop movements and resource extraction, particularly timber and agricultural products. The German role in the division was more limited in scope but strategically significant. Although Berlin did not claim large sections of Macedonia for direct annexation, it retained control over certain transit routes and military installations, essential for the Wehrmacht's operations in Greece and beyond. The Germans also kept a presence in key junctions during the initial occupation phase to oversee the transfer of authority to Bulgaria and Italy, ensuring that the territorial division did not hinder operational priorities. Additionally, a small area in the far north, bordering Kosovo, was tied to German-controlled Serbia for administrative purposes, primarily to maintain coherence in the military occupation zone extending from Belgrade. The partition was not only a matter of borders, but also of administrative integration. Bulgarian authorities moved quickly to formalize their control, dispatching civil servants, police, and teachers. Bulgarian became the official language in schools and government offices, and the levr replaced the Yugoslav dinar at fixed exchange rates. The Bulgarian army maintained garrisons in major towns, while local paramilitary formations were established to assist in security and surveillance. Italian administration in the west followed a similar pattern, though on a smaller scale, relying heavily on Albanian intermediaries to manage day-to-day governance. Italian military units were stationed in key towns to deter potential insurgency and to secure the border with German and Bulgarian zones. Economically, the partition altered trade patterns and resource flows. Agricultural surpluses from Macedonia were redirected toward the war economies of Bulgaria and Italy. The railway from Skopje to Thessaloniki, now under Bulgarian control, became a critical supply line for Axis operations in Greece. Italian-controlled areas, less developed in terms of transport infrastructure, saw investment in road improvements aimed at integrating them more closely with the Albanian network. For the civilian population, the division brought abrupt changes in identity documentation, official language, and legal systems. People found themselves reclassified as Bulgarian or Albanian subjects depending on their location, often with little regard for personal or family affiliations. While some welcomed the change, particularly among those with Bulgarian nationalist sympathies, others resisted, either passively by avoiding collaboration or actively by seeking contact with emerging resistance groups. These early months of occupation laid the foundations for a complex political landscape, in which loyalties were often fluid and shaped by both ideology and survival needs. By mid-1941, the territorial and administrative boundaries of the Axis-controlled Macedonia were firmly in place. The tripartite division under Bulgarian, Italian, and limited German oversight set the framework for the region's wartime governance. Yet, beneath the appearance of stability, tensions were already emerging, between the occupying powers themselves, between occupiers and civilians, and among the various local factions whose competing visions for Macedonia's future would increasingly come to the fore. The consolidation of Axis control over Macedonia after the April 1941 partition required coordinated military, administrative, and propaganda measures by Bulgaria, Italy, and, to a lesser extent, Germany. Each occupying power faced the dual challenge of establishing its authority in a region recently torn from Yugoslav control and addressing the complex social fabric of a population divided by language, religion, and political orientation. In the Bulgarian-administered zone, the government in Sofia prioritized rapid integration, aiming to present its presence as a restoration of legitimate national sovereignty rather than a foreign occupation. Bulgarian military units were stationed in major towns such as Skopje, Bitola, and Veles, while police detachments patrolled rural areas. Administrative departments were staffed predominantly by personnel brought from Bulgaria, including experienced civil servants, educators, and judicial officers. Schools reopened with Bulgarian as the sole language of instruction, and new curricula emphasized national history as interpreted by Sofia, linking the local population to the medieval Bulgarian state and its cultural legacy. Newspapers and radio broadcasts were reoriented to promote loyalty to Tsar Boris III and to highlight the role of Bulgaria within the Axis alliance. Economic policy under Bulgarian administration focused on redirecting agricultural production and key resources toward the Bulgarian war effort. The fertile plains along the Vardar River were placed under close state supervision to ensure grain and tobacco shipments met quotas. Trade links were reorganized to connect directly with Sofia and other Bulgarian cities, bypassing former Yugoslav commercial networks. The lev became the official currency, with exchange rates set to favor Bulgarian merchants and state procurement agencies. These measures generated some economic stability in the short term, but also fueled resentment among local producers who saw prices fixed below market value and goods requisitioned without adequate compensation. In the Italian-controlled western sector, administration was integrated into the structure of the Albanian kingdom, a protectorate established by Rome after its 1939 occupation of Albania. Italian authorities relied heavily on Albanian intermediaries for governance, including local gendarmes and municipal officials. This approach reflected both logistical limitations and the political objective of promoting an Albanian national identity in the annexed territories. Italian military garrisons in towns like Ohrid and Debar focused on maintaining security along the frontier with Bulgarian and German zones, while also ensuring that roads and supply routes into Albania remained operational. Italian investment was directed toward road improvements and limited public works, though these projects were constrained by wartime resource shortages. German involvement in Macedonia after the initial conquest was primarily strategic rather than administrative. Wehrmacht units retained control of key transit corridors for as long as military operations in Greece required secure communications. German military police monitored rail and road links between Skopje and Thessaloniki, ensuring that troop and supply movements faced no disruption. Although most of the territory was under Bulgarian or Italian jurisdiction, the presence of German forces served as a reminder that ultimate authority in the region rested with Berlin. Propaganda efforts by all three Axis powers sought to justify the new political order and win at least passive acceptance from the local population. Bulgarian authorities emphasized cultural and linguistic ties, organizing public ceremonies, erecting monuments, and restoring Orthodox churches under the jurisdiction of the Bulgarian Exarchate. Italian propaganda promoted the idea of a united Albanian state supported by Rome, while German messaging stressed the role of the Axis in bringing order and stability to the Balkans. However, the process of consolidating control was not without resistance or dissent. Some local communities, especially those with strong Yugoslav or Serbian identities, rejected the new authorities. Former Yugoslav officers and civil servants who refused to cooperate were dismissed, detained, or forced into exile. Political activists from the interwar period, whether aligned with the banned Communist Party of Yugoslavia or with nationalist organizations, began to re-establish underground networks. Cross-border contacts with resistance groups in occupied Serbia, Greece, and Albania were sporadic but growing, laying the groundwork for future armed movements. By the end of 1941, the surface appearance of Axis order in Macedonia masked underlying instability. While Bulgarian and Italian forces maintained formal control and administrative structures functioned on paper, discontent simmered in rural areas and urban neighborhoods alike. These tensions would soon interact with broader developments in the Balkans, as the German-Soviet War on the Eastern Front and the growth of partisan activity across Yugoslavia began to draw the Macedonian territories into a wider theater of conflict. The turning of 1942 saw the occupation authorities in Macedonia facing a growing array of security and political challenges. While the initial months after the April 1941 division had been marked by swift administrative restructuring, the second year of Axis control exposed the limits of imposed order in a region with deep-rooted political divisions and an increasingly active resistance environment. In the Bulgarian-administered sector, the government in Sofia continued to frame its presence as the fulfillment of a national unification mission. Bulgarian garrisons remained stationed in all major towns, with additional units deployed along critical transport corridors such as the Skopje-Thessaloniki Railway. The Bulgarian Ministry of Interior oversaw a network of police and state security organs tasked with monitoring political dissidents and suspected resistance sympathizers. Lists of former Yugoslav army personnel, civil servants, and activists were compiled to identify individuals deemed a threat to the new order. Arrests, interrogations, and, in some cases, deportations to detention facilities inside Bulgaria became more frequent as the year progressed. Economically, the occupation was shaped by wartime demands. The requisitioning of agricultural produce intensified, with the state setting strict quotas for grain, tobacco, wool, and livestock. Shortages in urban areas became more pronounced as local markets were absorbed into the Bulgarian supply chain, prioritizing the needs of the army and domestic consumers in Bulgaria proper. Price controls and fixed exchange rates continued to disadvantage local producers, prompting some to engage in black market trade. The authorities responded with anti-smuggling patrols and punitive measures, but clandestine commerce remained a persistent feature of the wartime economy. Italian administration in Western Macedonia experienced its own pressures. While the integration of these areas into the Albanian kingdom remained official policy, the reality on the ground was more complex. The Italian military command faced difficulties in maintaining effective control over rural districts, where loyalty to the central authorities in Tirana or Rome was limited. Albanian gendarmerie units, often recruited locally, were tasked with enforcing order, but their reliability varied. In some areas, personal or clan loyalties outweighed formal allegiance to the occupation regime. Italian infrastructure projects, such as road construction, proceeded slowly due to resource shortages, and the benefits were felt primarily by military convoys rather than civilian communities. German presence in Macedonia during 1942 was reduced but strategically significant. Small detachments of Wehrmacht troops and military police retained control over select transport hubs and key installations, particularly where supply lines to Greece intersected with partisan activity. German intelligence services monitored the political climate in both Bulgarian and Italian zones, reporting to Berlin on the effectiveness of Allied administration and potential threats to Axis cohesion in the region. Resistance activity, while still limited in scale compared to later years, began to take more organized forms. The Yugoslav Partisan movement, under the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, KPJ, worked to establish cells in towns and rural areas, exploiting dissatisfaction with economic requisitions and political repression. These early partisan units were small, often no more than a few dozen fighters, and relied heavily on mobility and local support. Sabotage of rail lines, attacks on police outposts, and the dissemination of anti-Axis leaflets were among their primary tactics. The Bulgarian authorities responded with intensified patrols, curfews, and mass searches in suspected resistance strongholds. Meanwhile, non-communist nationalist groups also operated in the region, though their goals varied. Some favored the restoration of Yugoslavia, while others advocated for Macedonian autonomy or alignment with Bulgaria. The Axis powers viewed these groups with suspicion, aware that political allegiances could shift rapidly under wartime conditions. The competition between different resistance factions complicated the occupation authorities' efforts to maintain order, as local disputes sometimes escalated into violence independent of direct Axis involvement. By late 1942, the interplay of occupation policies, economic hardship, and emerging resistance had transformed Macedonia into a zone of latent instability. Although frontline combat remained far from the region, the strategic value of its transport links and resources ensured that all three occupying powers, Bulgaria, Italy, and Germany, remained invested in suppressing unrest. The following year would see this low-level conflict intensify, as regional dynamics became increasingly intertwined with the broader trajectory of the Second World War in the Balkans. The year 1943 marked a decisive escalation of conflict within occupied Macedonia, as the region's relative calm of the early occupation years gave way to sustained armed resistance and increasingly harsh countermeasures by Axis authorities. This shift was driven by several converging factors: the growth of the Yugoslav partisan movement across the Balkans, the weakening of Italian control following military setbacks elsewhere, and the gradual alignment of local anti-Axis forces with the broader Allied strategy. In the Bulgarian-administered zone, Sofia intensified its security apparatus to counter the rising number of partisan attacks. Bulgarian army units, supported by gendarmerie and auxiliary police, launched a series of anti-guerrilla operations in rural districts, particularly in the mountainous terrain around Kičevo, Prilep, and Kriva Palanka. These operations aimed to encircle suspected partisan concentrations, destroy supply caches, and arrest suspected collaborators. However, the rugged geography and strong local support networks often allowed resistance fighters to evade capture. Bulgarian military reports from mid-1943 noted repeated instances of rail sabotage along the Skopje-Thessaloniki line, forcing the deployment of armed train escorts and repair crews. The partisan movement in Macedonia expanded both in numbers and organization during this period. Led by cadres of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, KPJ, local detachments began to form larger operational groups, capable of engaging in prolonged skirmishes with Axis forces. Recruitment drew from disaffected youth, deserters from Bulgarian and Italian-controlled units, and individuals displaced by requisitions or political repression. The movement also benefited from the shifting fortunes of the war. Allied victories in North Africa and the Soviet advance on the Eastern Front provided both propaganda material and practical encouragement to those resisting the occupation. In the Italian zone, control was increasingly contested. Italian forces in Western Macedonia faced mounting difficulties in maintaining authority over rural areas, where partisan influence grew steadily. The mountainous border with Albania facilitated cross-border operations by resistance groups, complicating Italian efforts to isolate insurgents. Supply shortages, combined with low morale among Italian troops, many of whom were conscripts, further weakened their effectiveness. Local Albanian gendarmerie units, on which Italian authorities relied heavily, were sometimes accused of shifting loyalties or engaging in autonomous actions not aligned with Rome's directives. German involvement in Macedonia deepened during 1943, partly in response to the weakening of Italian authority and the growing partisan threat. Wehrmacht units conducted joint operations with Bulgarian forces, particularly in areas of strategic importance such as key rail junctions and passes leading into Greece. German military intelligence also worked to map partisan networks, using informants and intercepted communications to anticipate attacks. The Abwehr and Gestapo maintained liaison offices in Skopje, coordinating with Bulgarian security agencies to share intelligence and coordinate counterinsurgency strategies. The population experienced increasing hardship as the conflict intensified. Requisitioning of food and livestock reached new levels to meet Axis military needs, leaving less for local consumption. In retaliation for partisan actions, Bulgarian and Italian forces conducted punitive expeditions against villages suspected of providing shelter or supplies to resistance fighters. These actions often included property destruction, mass arrests, and, in some cases, deportations. The cycle of attack and reprisal hardened divisions within communities, as some sought to avoid reprisals by distancing themselves from insurgents, while others deepened their support for the resistance out of anger at occupation measures. By late summer 1943, the collapse of Italy's fascist regime had a direct and immediate impact on Macedonia. The Italian surrender in September created a power vacuum in the Western Zone, with German forces moving quickly to take over former Italian positions. In many areas, partisans attempted to exploit the transition, seizing arms from retreating Italian units and establishing temporary control over rural districts. German countermeasures were swift, reasserting Axis authority through a combination of rapid troop deployments, air reconnaissance, and coordinated sweeps. The change in administration brought Western Macedonia under de facto German military control, though Bulgaria sought to expand its jurisdiction into some of the former Italian-held areas. By the end of 1943, Macedonia was no longer a relatively quiet rear area of the Axis-controlled Balkans, but an active theater of insurgency and counterinsurgency. The combined effects of shifting frontline dynamics, the breakdown of Italian control, and the strengthening of partisan forces set the stage for even larger confrontations in 1944, when the strategic situation in the Balkans would begin to turn decisively against the Axis powers. The opening months of 1944 brought Macedonia into a new phase of the conflict, defined by intensified partisan operations, shifting alliances, and the gradual erosion of Axis capacity to maintain full control. The war's broader trajectory was now against Germany and its allies, and developments elsewhere in the Balkans directly influenced the pace and scale of events in the region. In the Bulgarian-administered sector, security measures became more militarized and reactive. The Bulgarian army increased the number of troops stationed in key urban centers such as Skopje, Bitola, and Štip, while expanding patrol coverage in rural districts known for partisan activity. Large-scale anti-partisan offensives were launched in early spring, often involving coordinated sweeps through multiple villages. These operations combined infantry advances with artillery bombardments of suspected hideouts, as well as aerial reconnaissance to track partisan movements. Despite temporary successes in capturing weapons and detaining suspected fighters, these offensives rarely achieved lasting suppression. Resistance groups frequently dispersed before encirclement and reassembled once Axis forces withdrew. The partisan movement in Macedonia reached a new level of organization and coordination in 1944. The National Liberation Army of Macedonia, operating under the broader Yugoslav Partisan command, began to field brigades capable of sustained combat against Bulgarian, German, and collaborationist forces. These units increasingly carried out attacks on transport infrastructure, including the Skopje-Thessaloniki railway and key road junctions. Ambushes on Axis convoys became more frequent, particularly in the mountainous terrain where mechanized units had limited mobility. By mid-year, the partisans were not only disrupting supply lines, but also temporarily controlling certain rural zones, using them as bases for recruitment, training, and political mobilization. German forces, already overstretched across multiple fronts, adopted a more selective approach to their presence in Macedonia. They concentrated on securing strategic assets, rail lines, depots, and communication nodes, rather than attempting to police the countryside extensively. Nevertheless, when German units did engage, they employed a high degree of firepower and rapid mobility, often combining armored cars, infantry, and close air support. Joint operations with Bulgarian forces remained common, though differences in operational priorities occasionally created friction between the two allies. In the former Italian zone, now under German control since late 1943, resistance activity surged. The absence of a stable occupation administration during the transition period had allowed partisan influence to expand, and German efforts to reimpose order faced constant challenges. Local Albanian militias, which had previously served under Italian direction, were reorganized under German supervision, but their loyalty varied, and their effectiveness in anti-partisan warfare was inconsistent. Some militia units engaged in reprisals against communities suspected of harboring Yugoslav-oriented partisans, deepening ethnic and political tensions. Civilian life in 1944 was marked by severe wartime deprivation. Requisitioning of food, livestock, and fuel intensified as Axis forces struggled to supply their garrisons and transport materials to other fronts. Allied air raids on transport hubs, particularly in Skopje, Veles, and Kumanovo, added to the disruption of daily life, causing civilian casualties and further straining the economy. These bombings were aimed at weakening Axis logistics, but also underscored to the population that the war's momentum was shifting. Politically, the resistance movement worked to consolidate support through the establishment of local committees and councils in liberated areas. These bodies organized food distribution, maintained rudimentary order, and disseminated propaganda in favor of the Yugoslav Partisans' vision for a post-war federal state. The Bulgarian authorities viewed this political activity as a direct threat to their control and responded with mass arrests, executions of captured fighters, and efforts to infiltrate partisan networks with informants. By mid-1944, the broader strategic situation in the Balkans was changing rapidly. The Soviet advance through Romania and the increasing likelihood of Bulgaria's withdrawal from the Axis created uncertainty among occupation forces. German military planners began considering contingency measures for a possible retreat from Greece and the southern Balkans, which would require secure transit through Macedonia. This reality heightened the urgency of maintaining control over the region's main transport corridors, even as partisan forces sought to disrupt them at every opportunity. As summer turned to autumn, Macedonia's role in the conflict was shifting from an occupied rear area to a contested zone of strategic withdrawal and liberation. The final months of Axis control would be shaped by the collapse of Bulgaria's wartime alignment, the retreat of German forces, and the decisive push of the partisan movement to establish its authority before the arrival of other Allied or Soviet forces. In September 1944, the political and military balance in Macedonia shifted abruptly following Bulgaria's withdrawal from the Axis and its declaration of war against Germany. This reversal, prompted by the Soviet advance into the Balkans and the collapse of German positions in Romania, instantly transformed former Bulgarian occupation forces into active participants in operations against their erstwhile ally. The changeover, however, was far from orderly, and for several weeks the region was marked by chaotic realignments, local clashes, and a scramble for control of key territory. Bulgarian troops stationed in Macedonia received orders to switch sides and cooperate with the Yugoslav Partisans and advancing Soviet-aligned forces. In some areas, the transition was smooth, with units coordinating with local resistance to expel German garrisons. In other places, particularly where relations with the population had been tense during the occupation, there were outbreaks of violence, reprisals, or desertions. Bulgarian commanders prioritized securing main transport routes and strategic towns such as Skopje, Bitola, and Kumanovo, both to deny them to retreating German forces and to facilitate the movement of their own troops northward into Serbia, where major battles against the Wehrmacht were unfolding. German forces, caught between the need to withdraw from Greece and the rapid collapse of their Bulgarian ally, moved swiftly to secure escape corridors through Macedonia. The Wehrmacht concentrated on holding vital junctions long enough to allow columns retreating from the Aegean coast to pass. These rearguard actions often involved heavily armed Kampfgruppen, ad hoc battle groups, combining infantry, armor, and artillery. Skirmishes with both Bulgarian troops and Yugoslav partisans were frequent, especially along the Vardar Valley and in mountain passes leading into Kosovo. The Luftwaffe conducted limited air operations to cover withdrawals, but fuel shortages and Allied air superiority limited their impact. The Yugoslav partisan movement seized the opportunity created by the fluid situation to expand its control dramatically. In many rural areas, partisan brigades moved in immediately after German or Bulgarian withdrawals, setting up local administrations and securing food supplies. They launched coordinated offensives against remaining German strongpoints, often with Bulgarian units now acting as allies. The capture of towns like Prilep and Kičevo brought significant gains in manpower and materiel, as captured stockpiles of weapons and ammunition were redistributed to sustain the campaign. In the former Italian zone of Western Macedonia, still under German control at the start of September, the withdrawal process was complicated by the presence of local militias. Some Albanian units sought to maintain control over territory independently, resisting both partisan and Bulgarian advances. This led to localized conflicts that were separate from the main German retreat, further fragmenting the security situation. German commanders, focused on their own strategic withdrawal, rarely intervened in these disputes unless they directly threatened evacuation routes. Civilians experienced this transitional period with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. The departure of Axis occupation forces ended years of military rule, but the rapid succession of new authorities created instability. In some towns, residents welcomed the partisans and their promises of liberation. In others, memories of wartime hardships under Bulgarian administration complicated the reception. Food shortages persisted, worsened by the disruption of transport and the demands of moving armies. Allied air attacks on retreating German convoys sometimes struck near populated areas, adding to the danger faced by non-combatants. By October 1944, German forces had begun a general retreat toward Kosovo and Serbia, abandoning most of Macedonia. Rearguard fighting continued in certain areas, but the strategic priority for the Wehrmacht was now to avoid encirclement by converging Bulgarian, Yugoslav, and Soviet forces. The partisans, for their part, moved rapidly to consolidate political control, holding assemblies in liberated towns and integrating local militias into their command structure. Bulgarian forces, now operating under Allied coordination, participated in joint operations into southern Serbia and Kosovo, marking the final phase of their wartime presence in Macedonia. The autumn of 1944 thus marked the decisive end of Axis rule in Macedonia. What had begun in April 1941 as a carefully managed division of territory between allies ended in a hurried German withdrawal, shifting alliances, and the rapid emergence of a new political order. The stage was set for the post-war integration of Macedonia into the federal structure of socialist Yugoslavia, but the process of political consolidation would unfold amid the lingering scars of occupation, shifting loyalties, and the unsettled question of the region's long-term identity. By late October 1944, Macedonia was largely cleared of German forces, but the departure of the Wehrmacht did not bring an immediate end to armed conflict. The power vacuum left by the Axis retreat intensified the struggle between the Yugoslav Partisans, now the dominant military force in the region, and various local factions seeking to influence the post-war political settlement. The partisan leadership, aligned with Josip Broz Tito's central command, moved quickly to ensure that Macedonia's liberation would translate into its incorporation into the new federal Yugoslav state, rather than leaving room for alternative political arrangements. Partisan brigades, many of which had grown in size and discipline through years of guerrilla warfare, now operated as organized military formations capable of conventional engagements. They secured major cities, Skopje, Bitola, Tetovo, and expanded their presence into rural districts. In each liberated area, they established national liberation committees to oversee administration, food distribution, and local security. These bodies also served as political instruments, promoting the partisan program of federal unification and discouraging competing nationalist or separatist movements. One of the most pressing challenges for the new authorities was the disarmament of groups that had operated under different allegiances during the occupation. Some local militias, particularly in ethnically mixed areas, resisted disarmament, either due to political opposition to the partisans or fears of reprisals. This was especially pronounced in the western districts, where Albanian armed groups, initially organized under Italian and later German auspices, retained a presence. Skirmishes between these militias and partisan units continued into the winter, with both sides seeking to control key villages and supply routes. Bulgarian forces, though now formally allied with the partisans, began withdrawing from Macedonia in accordance with Allied agreements and political directives from Sofia. Their exit was largely completed by November 1944, though joint operations into southern Serbia continued. The departure of Bulgarian troops removed one layer of foreign military presence, but also left gaps in security that partisan forces had to fill rapidly. The liberation period also brought to the forefront questions of justice and retribution. The partisan command initiated a process of identifying and prosecuting individuals accused of collaboration with Axis authorities. This included former members of the Bulgarian administration, local police, and militia leaders, as well as civilians suspected of aiding the occupiers. In some cases, summary trials were held, leading to executions or imprisonment. While these actions were presented as necessary measures to secure the revolution and prevent sabotage, they also deepened political divisions, especially among communities where collaboration charges were contested. Economically, the immediate post-occupation months were marked by severe disruption. The transport network, already damaged by years of sabotage and Allied bombing, was further degraded by the German withdrawal, during which retreating forces destroyed bridges, rail lines, and depots. Agricultural production, the mainstay of the Macedonian economy, had been depleted by successive years of requisitions, leaving shortages of seed, livestock, and tools. Partisan authorities attempted to address the crisis through requisitioning remaining surpluses for redistribution, but these measures often strained relations with rural communities. At the same time, the liberation of Macedonia was accompanied by an intensive propaganda campaign. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and public assemblies emphasized the unity of the South Slavs under the new Yugoslav Federation and celebrated the sacrifices of the resistance movement. The narrative promoted by the partisan leadership framed the events of 1941-1944 as a struggle not only for liberation from Axis occupation, but also for the establishment of a socialist state. Alternative interpretations, whether emphasizing Macedonian independence, Bulgarian cultural ties, or Albanian autonomy, were sidelined or actively suppressed. By the end of 1944, the military front had moved north into Serbia, but Macedonia remained an active zone of political consolidation. The Yugoslav Partisans had achieved their immediate objective of removing Axis forces and asserting control over the region. Yet the tasks of reconstruction, reconciliation, and integration into the new state lay ahead. The coming year would determine how firmly Macedonia would be anchored within the Yugoslav Federation, and how the wartime experiences of division, occupation, and resistance would shape its post-war trajectory. The year 1945 opened with Macedonia firmly under the control of the Yugoslav Partisans, now transformed into the regular army of the new democratic federal Yugoslavia. The armed struggle against the Axis had ended in the region, but the political and social reordering that followed was a direct continuation of wartime dynamics. The new authorities sought to consolidate their power, rebuild infrastructure, and integrate Macedonia as one of the constituent republics in the emerging federal system, while neutralizing any potential opposition. One of the first priorities was the institutionalization of governance. The Anti-Fascist Assembly for the National Liberation of Macedonia, ASNOM, convened in August 1944 in Kumanovo and Prespa, now operated as the highest legislative body of the republic. It endorsed the framework of a federal Yugoslavia as decided by Tito's central government and codified Macedonian as the official language for administration, education, and cultural life. The creation of a Macedonian language press, the reopening of schools, and the establishment of cultural institutions were presented as symbols of national recognition within the federation. However, these developments were also accompanied by strict alignment with the socialist program of the new state, leaving little room for alternative political movements. The question of wartime collaboration continued to dominate the early post-war months. People accused of serving in the Bulgarian or Italian administrations, or of cooperating with German forces during the final year of the occupation, faced legal proceedings. Special courts, often operating under summary procedures, issued sentences ranging from imprisonment to execution. These measures aimed to remove remnants of Axis-aligned structures, but also served as a tool for eliminating political rivals. In some rural areas, these purges caused lasting resentment, especially where the line between collaboration and pragmatic survival during the occupation had been blurred. Economically, the country faced the formidable task of recovery. Transport infrastructure was a top priority. Railway lines between Skopje and Thessaloniki, as well as those connecting to Serbia, were repaired to restore trade and military mobility. Roads damaged by combat or German demolitions were rebuilt, often using forced labor from prisoners or requisitioned civilians. Agricultural recovery was equally urgent. The state organized seed distribution, livestock replenishment, and land reform measures aimed at breaking up larger estates and redistributing land to smallholders, aligning with the socialist agenda of agrarian transformation. Social policy focused on reintegrating war veterans, caring for war orphans, and providing aid to displaced persons. Veterans were often given preference in employment and education, while orphanages and relief programs were established in major towns. The new government also promoted women's participation in public life, drawing on the significant role they had played in the partisan movement, although traditional social structures in many rural areas limited the extent of these changes in practice. Politically, the integration of Macedonia into Yugoslavia was accompanied by a deliberate effort to redefine the region's identity. While the recognition of a Macedonian nation within the Yugoslav Federation was a historic first, this recognition was firmly tied to loyalty to the federal center. Cross-border cultural and political connections with Bulgaria were discouraged, and any advocacy for unification with Bulgaria was treated as subversive. The same applied to Albanian nationalist aspirations in the western districts, where the government reinforced administrative control and promoted integration through the education system and local governance structures. By mid-1945, the war in Europe had ended, but the memory of occupation, partition, and resistance remained central to the political narrative promoted by the Yugoslav authorities. Official commemorations emphasized the unity of the South Slavic peoples and the decisive role of the partisan struggle in liberating Macedonia from 3 years of Axis control. The divisions imposed in 1941 between Bulgarian, Italian, and German zones were recast as a historical wrong, corrected by the Socialist Revolution. The legacy of the 1941-1944 occupation continued to influence the region's post-war trajectory. The administrative and economic reorientation that had occurred under Axis rule left behind altered trade patterns, new infrastructure, and redefined borders, while the experience of living under 3 distinct occupation regimes deepened local awareness of the geopolitical vulnerability of Macedonia. In the Yugoslav framework, these lessons were used to justify centralized control, rapid militarization, and the suppression of political pluralism in the name of safeguarding the unity and independence of the state. By the end of 1945, Macedonia had completed its transformation from a contested territory under three flags to a constituent republic within a socialist federation. The scars of the war, physical, political, and social, remained visible, but the new order sought to embed them within a unifying narrative of liberation and reconstruction. This post-war settlement would define the region's political and national identity for decades, shaping how the events of the wartime division were remembered and debated in the years to come.